7 years ago, Alan Morrison disappeared after finishing his evening meal outside Murphy's Diner on the outskirts of Dulce, New Mexico, without leaving a trace. The 54-year-old homeless man, who had become a beloved fixture in the small desert town, simply vanished into the high desert night, plunging restaurant owners Edward and Sarah Murphy into a devastating search that would consume their lives and expose a conspiracy that reaches into the darkest corners of government secrecy. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. Alan wasn't just another statistic in America's homeless crisis. For 3 years, he had been the unofficial guardian of Murphy's Diner's back alley, a gentle soul who helped with odd jobs in exchange for hot meals and basic necessities. Edward Murphy, a Vietnam veteran who understood the struggles of displacement, and his wife Sarah, a former school nurse with a heart for the forgotten, had grown to love Alan like family. When he failed to appear for his usual evening meal on March 15, 2003, they knew something was terribly wrong. The initial police response was tragically predictable. Detective Ray Castellanos of the Dulce Police Department filed a missing person report, but with limited resources and the assumption that homeless individuals often move without warning, the investigation was cursory at best. "He probably just moved on to the next town," was the dismissive attitude that would haunt this case for years. But Edward and Sarah refused to accept this explanation. They knew Alan's routines, his fears, his dreams of one day reconnecting with his estranged daughter in California. This wasn't a man who would simply disappear without a word. As days turned into weeks, the Murphys launched their own desperate search. They distributed flyers throughout the Four Corners region, contacted homeless shelters across New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, and drove countless miles through the unforgiving desert landscape, hoping to find any trace of their friend. Sarah's nursing background had taught her to notice details others missed, and she began documenting every aspect of Alan's disappearance with methodical precision. She recorded his last known conversations, mapped his daily routines, and interviewed every person who had seen him in the days before he vanished. What emerged from Sarah's investigation was a disturbing pattern that local law enforcement had either ignored or failed to recognize. Alan wasn't the first homeless person to disappear from the Dulce area. Over the previous 2 years, at least 6 other individuals living on the streets had vanished without explanation. Miguel Santos, 42, disappeared in August 2001. Jennifer Crow Williams, 38, vanished in November 2001. Tommy Begay, a 51-year-old Navajo veteran, was last seen in April 2002. The list continued, each name representing a life dismissed by society and forgotten by the system meant to protect them. The pattern was as chilling as it was clear. All the missing individuals were frequent visitors to the area around Murphy's Diner, all were known to local residents, and all had disappeared during evening hours without any witnesses or evidence of foul play. Yet despite Sarah's detailed documentation and the Murphys' persistent advocacy, the police maintained that these were unrelated incidents involving a transient population known for unpredictable movement patterns. Detective Castellanos, overwhelmed by more pressing cases and constrained by departmental priorities that didn't include intensive investigations of missing homeless persons, eventually allowed Alan's case to go cold. The file was transferred to a storage facility, joining hundreds of other unsolved disappearances that plague small-town America. But for Edward and Sarah Murphy, the case was far from closed. The years following Alan's disappearance transformed Edward and Sarah Murphy from small-town restaurant owners into relentless advocates for the forgotten. Their grief had evolved into something more powerful and dangerous to those who preferred these cases remain buried, an unwavering determination to find the truth, no matter how long it took or how deep they had to dig. Sarah had converted the spare room above Murphy's Diner into what she called her war room. The walls were covered with maps of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah, each marked with red pins, indicating locations where homeless individuals had been reported missing over the past decade. Newspaper clippings, police reports, and photographs of the missing created a haunting gallery of society's most vulnerable citizens. At the center of it all was Alan's picture, taken just 2 weeks before his disappearance, showing his weathered but kind face as he helped Sarah plant flowers in the diner's small garden. Edward, meanwhile, had become an unlikely detective. His military training had given him skills in reconnaissance and investigation that proved invaluable in tracking down leads the police had abandoned. He spent his mornings managing the diner and his afternoons driving through the vast desert landscape, visiting truck stops, homeless camps, and border towns, always carrying a folder of photographs and always asking the same questions. Have you seen this man? Do you know what happened to the people who used to sleep behind Murphy's diner? The couple's obsession with finding Alan had strained their marriage and their business. Regular customers began to avoid the diner, uncomfortable with Sarah's intense questioning about anything they might have seen or heard. Local law enforcement grew irritated with their constant inquiries and Freedom of Information Act requests. Friends and family urged them to move on, to accept that Alan was probably dead and that continuing their search was destroying their lives. But they couldn't let go. In 2005, their persistence paid off in an unexpected way. While researching missing persons cases throughout the Southwest, Sarah discovered a disturbing connection that had escaped official notice. The disappearances weren't random or limited to Dulce. She found documented cases of homeless individuals vanishing from communities throughout New Mexico, particularly in areas near sensitive government installations and Native American reservations. The pattern suggested something far more sinister than random violence or natural causes. Sarah's nursing background had taught her to look for symptoms that others might miss, and she began to see the disappearances as symptoms of a larger disease affecting the region. She noted that many of the missing individuals had been veterans, people with mental health issues, or those who had expressed paranoid beliefs about government surveillance and experimentation. These were people who, even if they tried to report strange experiences, would likely be dismissed as delusional or unreliable witnesses. Edward's military connections proved crucial in this phase of their investigation. Through a network of former servicemen who had worked at various classified facilities throughout the Southwest, he began to hear whispered rumors about unusual activities in the desert. Former guards at Los Alamos National Laboratory spoke of strange transportation patterns involving unmarked vehicles traveling through remote areas at night. A retired Air Force sergeant mentioned seeing unusual medical equipment being transported to facilities that officially didn't exist. The most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, Miguel's sister, contacted Sarah after reading about their search efforts in a regional newspaper. Maria had been conducting her own investigation into her brother's disappearance and had uncovered information that chilled Sarah to the bone. Miguel had told Maria just days before he vanished that he had been approached by men in civilian clothes who offered him money to participate in what they called a medical research study. He had been suspicious and refused, but he told Maria he had seen other homeless individuals from the area getting into unmarked vans. This revelation transformed the Murphys' understanding of what they were investigating. These weren't random disappearances or crimes of opportunity. Someone was systematically targeting the most vulnerable members of society, people whose absence wouldn't be noticed or investigated, people who had no families to ask uncomfortable questions or resources to demand answers. The implications were terrifying, and they suggested a level of organization and official protection that made their amateur investigation extremely dangerous. As 2006 arrived, Edward and Sarah faced a crucial decision. They could continue their private investigation, risking their safety and their sanity, or they could try to interest federal authorities in a case that local law enforcement had dismissed. They chose to press forward, driven by a promise they had made to Alan's memory, and a growing awareness that they might be the only people standing between other vulnerable individuals and whatever fate had befallen their friend. By 2007, Edward and Sarah Murphy had transformed from grieving friends into amateur investigators whose persistence had begun to attract dangerous attention. Their relentless pursuit of the truth about Alan's disappearance had uncovered a web of connections that stretched far beyond a simple missing person case, reaching into the shadowy world of classified government operations and experiments that officially didn't exist. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Dr. Helena Vasquez, a former medical technician who had worked at an undisclosed facility in northern New Mexico during the early 2000s, contacted Sarah through an encrypted email that would change everything. Dr. Vasquez had been following the Murphys' investigation through local news coverage and recognized details that made her blood run cold. She claimed to have worked at a facility that conducted medical experiments on homeless individuals who had been recruited through a program that promised cash payments for simple medical tests. Elena's story was both incredible and terrifyingly specific. She described an underground complex hidden beneath the high desert, officially denied by government agencies, but rumored among those who worked in classified programs to be a joint operation involving multiple agencies and private contractors. The facility, she claimed, conducted experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights, targeting individuals who wouldn't be missed and whose disappearances wouldn't trigger intensive investigations. The facility Elena described matched disturbing rumors that had circulated among conspiracy theorists and UFO researchers for decades. Stories of an underground base near Dulce, New Mexico, where government scientists allegedly conducted genetic experiments involving both human subjects and recovered alien technology. These stories had always been dismissed as the fantasies of paranoid minds, but Elena's detailed account contained specific information that convinced Sarah she was telling the truth about something, even if the full extent of the conspiracy remained unclear. According to Elena, the recruitment process was sophisticated and carefully planned. Teams of researchers would identify homeless individuals in communities throughout the Southwest, focusing particularly on veterans and people with mental health issues who were less likely to be believed if they tried to report unusual experiences. These individuals would be approached with offers of cash payments for participation in medical studies, with promises of comfortable accommodations and regular meals. For people living on the streets, desperate for basic necessities, it was an irresistible offer. Elena claimed she had resigned from her position in late 2003, shortly after witnessing procedures that violated her medical oath and her conscience. She had tried to report what she had seen through official channels, but her security clearance had been revoked, and she had been threatened with prosecution under national security statutes if she continued to ask questions. For 4 years, she had remained silent, haunted by guilt and fear, until reading about the Murphys' search for Alan convinced her she had to speak. The details Eleanor provided about Alan's final days were both heartbreaking and horrifying. She claimed to remember him specifically because of his gentle demeanor and his repeated requests to contact Edward and Sarah Murphy to let them know he was safe. Alan had apparently been told he was participating in a routine medical study that would last several weeks, with promises of payment that would help him travel to California to reunite with his daughter. Instead, he had been subjected to experimental procedures that Elena refused to describe in detail, beyond saying they involved genetic material and technologies she didn't fully understand. Sarah documented every word of Elena's testimony, recording their conversations and collecting what limited documentation Elena had been able to preserve from her time at the facility. The evidence was fragmentary and difficult to verify, but it provided the first concrete explanation for the pattern of disappearances that had consumed the Murphys' lives for 4 years. More importantly, it gave them a direction for their investigation and a reason to believe that Alan's fate, however tragic, might finally be revealed. Edward's military experience proved crucial in evaluating Elena's claims. He recognized details about military contractors, security protocols, and classified operations that suggested she had indeed worked within the government's secret programs. Her knowledge of specific military procedures and classified terminology was too accurate to be the product of internet research or conspiracy theory speculation. Whatever had happened at the facility she described, Elena had been there. The challenge now was determining how to proceed with information that was both explosive and dangerous. Eleanor warned them that others who had tried to expose the program had faced harassment, legal threats, and worse. She urged them to contact federal investigators or journalists with experience in government cover-ups, but she also made clear that their investigation had already attracted attention from people who preferred these secrets remain buried. As 2008 began, Edward and Sarah faced their greatest challenge yet. They possessed information that could explain Alan's disappearance and potentially save other lives, but they also understood that pursuing the truth could destroy their lives or worse. The small-town restaurant owners had stumbled into a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, and they were running out of time to decide whether justice for Alan was worth risking everything they had left. The phone call that changed everything came on a cold February morning in 2008. FBI Special Agent Marcus Chen contacted Edward Murphy directly, bypassing local law enforcement and speaking with an urgency that immediately put Edward on high alert. Agent Chen explained that the Bureau had become aware of the Murphys' investigation through monitoring communications related to classified government programs, and that their safety might be at risk due to the sensitive nature of the information they had uncovered. What Edward didn't know was that Dr. Elena Vasquez had been under federal surveillance since her initial contact with Sarah. The FBI had intercepted their encrypted communications as part of a broader investigation into unauthorized disclosure of classified information, but Agent Chen's review of the case files had convinced him that the Murphys had stumbled onto something far more serious than a simple security breach. The pattern of disappearances they had documented matched intelligence reports about illegal human experimentation programs that the Bureau had been trying to investigate for years. Agent Chen arranged to meet the Murphys at a truck stop outside Farmington, New Mexico, far from Dulce and the prying eyes of local law enforcement who might have connections to the people they were investigating. The federal agent was younger than Edward had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of intense focus that came from working cases that most people couldn't imagine. He carried a thick folder of documents and photographs that made Sarah's amateur investigation look primitive by comparison. "What you've uncovered," Agent Chen told them, "is consistent with reports we've been receiving for over a decade about unauthorized medical experiments conducted at classified facilities throughout the Southwest. The problem is that these facilities operate with such high levels of security clearance that even federal investigators have difficulty accessing information about their activities." He spread photographs across the truck stop table, showing aerial surveillance images of desert installations that officially didn't exist. The FBI's investigation had begun in 2005 when families of missing veterans contacted the Bureau about disappearances that local law enforcement had failed to investigate adequately. Agent Chen's task force had identified a pattern similar to what the Murphys had discovered, but with resources and jurisdiction that allowed them to see the bigger picture. The disappearances weren't limited to New Mexico. They extended throughout the Southwest and involved a network of facilities connected to defense contractors and classified research programs. Agent Chen confirmed many of Elena Vasquez's claims about the underground facility near Dulce. According to classified documents his team had obtained through federal court orders, the installation was indeed real and had been conducting medical research under contracts with multiple government agencies. However, the nature of the experiments remained classified at levels so high that even his FBI task force couldn't access the details without risking national security violations. What Agent Chen could tell them was deeply disturbing. The facility had been recruiting subjects for medical experiments since at least 2001, targeting homeless individuals, veterans with PTSD, and people with mental health issues who were unlikely to be believed if they reported unusual experiences. The recruitment methods matched what Elena had described: cash payments for participation in supposedly routine medical studies, with subjects transported to the facility under false pretenses. The federal investigation had been hampered by jurisdictional issues and the high classification levels associated with the facility's legitimate activities. While the FBI suspected that illegal human experimentation was occurring, proving it required evidence that was protected by national security restrictions. Several agents who had attempted to investigate too aggressively had found their careers ended and their security clearances revoked. The conspiracy reached into levels of government that made traditional law enforcement approaches extremely dangerous. Agent Chen revealed that Elena Vasquez was not the only whistleblower. Over the past 3 years, his task force had secretly interviewed more than a dozen former employees of various classified facilities throughout the region. Their testimonies painted a consistent picture of medical experiments that violated federal law and international human rights agreements. The subjects were told they were participating in routine medical research, but the actual procedures involved genetic manipulation, pharmaceutical testing, and other experiments that would have been illegal if conducted through normal medical research channels. The most chilling aspect of Agent Chen's investigation was his team's discovery of disposal methods for subjects who died during the experiments. According to classified documents they had obtained, bodies were cremated at the facility, and remains were scattered in remote desert locations where they would never be recovered. This explained why the Murphys' 4-year search for Alan had found no trace of him. There was nothing left to find. Edward and Sarah listened to Agent Chen's briefing with a mixture of vindication and horror. Their years of investigation had been vindicated, but the truth was worse than they had imagined. Alan hadn't simply been murdered. He had been subjected to medical torture before his death, and his remains had been destroyed to eliminate evidence of the crime. The gentle man who had helped Sarah plant flowers behind their diner had died in agony, far from anyone who cared about him, in service of experiments that should never have been conducted. Agent Chen made the Murphys an offer that would determine the rest of their lives. The FBI needed civilian witnesses who could testify about the pattern of disappearances and the recruitment methods used to target victims. Elena Vasquez had agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation, but her testimony alone wouldn't be sufficient to prosecute the responsible parties. The Murphys' years of documentation and their personal connection to one of the victims made them crucial witnesses in what would become the largest human rights prosecution in modern American history. The decision to cooperate with the federal investigation meant accepting FBI protection and agreeing to relocate far from New Mexico once the case went to trial. It meant abandoning Murphy's diner, their home, and their entire life in Dulce. But it also meant that Alan's death might finally bring justice for all the victims who had been forgotten by society and betrayed by the government that was supposed to protect them. As they drove back to Dulce that evening, Edward and Sarah understood that their 4-year quest for answers had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The raid on the Dulce facility happened at dawn on September 15, 2009, exactly 6 years and 6 months after Alan Morrison's disappearance. FBI tactical teams, supported by military personnel and federal marshals, descended on the underground complex with search warrants that had taken Agent Chen's task force 18 months to obtain through sealed federal court proceedings. What they discovered beneath the New Mexico desert would shock even experienced federal investigators and validate every horrific detail of Elena Vasquez's testimony. Edward and Sarah Murphy watched the raid from a secure location 10 miles away, protected by federal agents and surrounded by the mobile command center that Agent Chen had established for the operation. They had spent the previous year working with federal prosecutors, providing testimony and evidence that would be crucial for the criminal cases that would follow. Their amateur investigation had evolved into a key component of the largest human rights prosecution in modern American history. The facility's actual scope exceeded even the FBI's intelligence estimates. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed a complex that extended 7 levels underground, with separate sections for medical research, subject housing, disposal operations, and administrative offices. The installation had been operating for over 2 decades, under contracts with multiple government agencies, conducting experiments that violated virtually every principle of medical ethics and human rights established since the Nuremberg trials. Dr. Elena Vasquez accompanied the federal agents into the facility she had fled 6 years earlier, serving as a guide through the maze of corridors and laboratories where she had witnessed unspeakable crimes. Her detailed knowledge of the facility's layout proved crucial for locating evidence and understanding the scope of the illegal experimentation program. As she led investigators through the underground complex, Elena provided running commentary about the horrors she had witnessed in each room. The medical laboratories contained equipment and documentation that confirmed the worst fears of Agent Chen's investigation team. Detailed records showed that over 200 individuals had been subjected to experimental procedures over the facility's operational period, with a mortality rate that would have been criminal in any legitimate medical research program. The experiments involved genetic manipulation, pharmaceutical testing, psychological conditioning, and procedures that investigators still struggle to classify or understand. Alan Morrison's medical file was discovered in a secure storage area, along with detailed documentation of the procedures he had endured during his final weeks of life. Sarah broke down as Agent Chen read portions of the file, which recorded Alan's repeated requests to contact his friends at Murphy's Diner, and his growing awareness that he was not participating in the routine medical study he had been promised. The records showed that Alan had died on April 3, 2003, 3 weeks after his disappearance, following a series of genetic modification procedures that his body had been unable to survive. The disposal records were perhaps the most damning evidence recovered from the facility. Detailed logs showed the cremation and scattering locations for every subject who had died during the experiments, including precise GPS coordinates for where Alan's remains had been dispersed in the desert southwest of Dulce. For the first time in over 6 years, Edward and Sarah knew exactly what had happened to their friend and where his remains could be found. The facility's recruitment records revealed the sophisticated methods used to identify and target potential subjects throughout the Southwest. Teams of researchers had maintained detailed databases of homeless individuals, veterans with PTSD, and people with mental health issues in communities from El Paso to Phoenix. They had identified individuals who were isolated from family support systems and unlikely to be missed if they disappeared. Alan had been targeted because of his visibility around Murphy's diner and his expressed desire to travel to California, making him an ideal candidate for recruitment. Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, the facility's director, was arrested during the raid, along with 15 other medical personnel and security staff. Dr. Hawthorne, a former Army medical officer with clearances for classified research programs, had been overseeing illegal human experimentation for over a decade under contracts that provided legal cover for activities that would have been prosecuted as war crimes if conducted by enemy governments. Her arrest photos showed a woman in her early 60s who appeared completely shocked that her activities were being treated as criminal. The federal prosecutors working with Agent Chen's task force faced unprecedented challenges in bringing the case to trial. The facility had been operating under legitimate government contracts for classified research, and many of the individuals involved claimed they believed their activities were authorized by national security imperatives. The classification levels associated with some of the research made it difficult to present evidence in open court without compromising ongoing intelligence operations. Elena Vasquez's testimony would prove crucial in establishing that the medical personnel knew they were violating federal law and international human rights agreements. Her detailed knowledge of the facility's operations, combined with the documentary evidence recovered during the raid, provided prosecutors with the foundation they needed to pursue criminal charges against the responsible parties. Her decision to cooperate with the federal investigation had been motivated by guilt over her years of silence and determination to ensure that the victims received justice. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps Alan Morrison's story reach more people. The discovery of the Dulce facility's activities sent shockwaves through the medical research community and raised disturbing questions about oversight of classified government programs. Congressional hearings were scheduled to investigate how such a program could operate for decades without detection, and federal agencies scrambled to review other classified research contracts for similar violations. The case had evolved far beyond the search for one missing homeless man into a national scandal that would reshape government oversight of medical research. For Edward and Sarah Murphy, the raid represented both vindication and closure. Their 6-year search for Alan had uncovered a conspiracy that had victimized hundreds of vulnerable individuals, and their testimony would be crucial for ensuring that those responsible faced justice. But the knowledge of what Alan had endured in his final weeks would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a burden they carried as the price of learning the truth they had sought so desperately. The trial of Dr. Patricia Hawthorne and her co-conspirators began in federal court in Albuquerque on March 15, 2011, exactly 8 years after Alan Morrison's disappearance. The proceedings took place under unprecedented security measures, with portions of the testimony classified and closed to public observation due to national security concerns. Edward and Sarah Murphy sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery every day, representing not only Alan, but all the forgotten victims whose names had been recorded in the facility's meticulous files. Federal prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez had spent 2 years building a case that would establish legal precedent for prosecuting government-sanctioned human experimentation. The challenge was proving criminal intent when the defendants claimed they were operating under legitimate classified research contracts authorized by federal agencies. Rodriguez needed to demonstrate that the medical personnel knew they were violating federal law and international human rights agreements, despite the classification levels that supposedly authorized their activities. Dr. Elena Vasquez served as the prosecution's key witness, testifying about the deliberate deception used to recruit subjects and the horrific conditions within the facility. Her medical training allowed her to explain in technical detail how the experiments violated established research protocols and constituted torture under international law. Helena's testimony was emotionally devastating, describing her growing awareness that she was participating in crimes against humanity and her ultimate decision to flee rather than continue enabling the program. The defense strategy focused on classification levels and national security authorizations that supposedly legitimized the research program. Defense attorney Robert Manning argued that his clients were patriotic Americans conducting vital research for national defense, operating under contracts that provided legal authorization for activities that might seem questionable to civilian observers. Manning claimed that the prosecutors were undermining national security by revealing classified information in pursuit of a politically motivated prosecution. Agent Chen testified about the FBI's investigation and the pattern of disappearances that had led to the discovery of the facility. His testimony established the scope of the conspiracy and the sophisticated methods used to target vulnerable individuals throughout the Southwest. Chen's professional demeanor and extensive documentation provided credibility that countered defense claims about the legitimacy of the research program. Edward and Sarah Murphy's testimony proved emotionally powerful in establishing the human cost of the conspiracy. Sarah's detailed documentation of Alan's routines and personality helped the jury understand that the victims were real people with hopes and dreams, not abstract research subjects. Edward's military background allowed him to counter defense arguments about national security imperatives, explaining how legitimate classified research differed from the criminal activities conducted at the Dulce facility. The prosecution presented evidence recovered from the facility, including medical files that documented the torture and murder of over 200 individuals over 2 decades. The records showed that many subjects had attempted to withdraw from the program after realizing they were not participating in routine medical studies, but were prevented from leaving by security personnel. Some had been kept sedated for weeks to prevent them from interfering with ongoing experiments. Alan Morrison's medical file was entered as evidence, with portions read aloud in court despite Sarah's tears and Edward's visible anger. The records showed that Alan had maintained his gentle personality even under extreme duress, continuing to ask about his friends at Murphy's Diner and expressing concern for other subjects he had befriended. His final recorded words were a request that someone tell Edward and Sarah that he appreciated everything they had done for him. The most damning evidence came from video recordings that facility personnel had made of their procedures, apparently for training purposes or documentation of their research methods. The footage showed subjects who were clearly distressed and confused, asking questions about their treatment and begging to be allowed to leave. Dr. Hawthorne could be seen in several recordings, calmly directing procedures while subjects pleaded for help. Defense attempts to claim national security authorization collapsed when prosecution witnesses testified that no legitimate government agency had authorized human experimentation of the type conducted at the facility. Former Pentagon officials confirmed that the contracts in question were for equipment testing and theoretical research, not live subject experimentation. The classification levels had been used to hide criminal activity, not protect legitimate national security operations. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against Dr. Hawthorne and 12 co-defendants. The convictions included charges of murder, conspiracy, violation of civil rights, and crimes against humanity. Dr. Hawthorne received a life sentence without possibility of parole, while other defendants received sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years in federal prison. The verdicts established important legal precedents for prosecuting government-sanctioned human experimentation. Congressional hearings following the trial resulted in significant changes to oversight procedures for classified research programs. New regulations required independent monitoring of all research involving human subjects, regardless of classification levels, and established whistleblower protections for personnel who reported suspected violations. The reforms were named the Morrison Act, in honor of Alan and the other victims whose deaths had exposed the conspiracy. For Edward and Sarah Murphy, the trial's conclusion brought a measure of closure but little peace. They had succeeded in obtaining justice for Alan and the other victims, but the knowledge of what their friend had endured would haunt them forever. They used the Victim Compensation Awards to establish a foundation providing services to homeless individuals, ensuring that Alan's memory would be honored through efforts to protect the vulnerable people he had represented. The Dulce facility was permanently closed and sealed, its underground chambers filled with concrete to prevent future use. The site was designated a memorial to the victims, with a simple granite marker bearing the names of all 200 individuals who had died in the illegal experiments. Alan Morrison's name was first on the list, recognizing his role in exposing the conspiracy through the persistence of two people who refused to let him be forgotten: the conviction of Dr. Patricia Hawthorne and her conspirators sent shockwaves throughout the classified research community. But for Edward and Sarah Murphy, the legal victory was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. As 2012 dawned, congressional investigations had uncovered evidence suggesting that the Dulce facility was not an isolated case, but part of a broader network of illegal experimentation programs that had operated throughout the American Southwest for decades. Senator Maria Gonzalez, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, launched a comprehensive investigation into classified research programs following the Dulce revelations. Her committee's work uncovered a disturbing pattern of facilities operating under legitimate government contracts while conducting unauthorized human experimentation. The programs had targeted the most vulnerable members of society: homeless individuals, veterans with PTSD, undocumented immigrants, and people with mental health issues, specifically because their disappearances were unlikely to trigger intensive investigations. Dr. Elena Vasquez had become a reluctant celebrity in the medical ethics community, speaking at conferences and universities about the dangers of classified research programs operating without proper oversight. Her testimony before Congress was particularly powerful, describing how intelligent, well-educated medical professionals had convinced themselves that their activities were justified by national security imperatives. Elena's insider knowledge revealed the psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary crimes. The Dulce case had also exposed significant failures in law enforcement coordination and information sharing. Agent Chen's investigation revealed that the FBI, local police departments, and tribal authorities had all received reports about missing persons that fit the pattern of recruitment for illegal experimentation, but no agency had recognized the connections or shared information effectively. The lack of coordination had allowed the conspiracy to continue for years longer than necessary, costing additional lives that might have been saved. Edward and Sarah's victim impact statements during the sentencing hearings had been particularly emotional, describing not only their personal loss, but also the broader social failure that had made Alan's victimization possible. Sarah testified about the systematic dehumanization of homeless individuals that made their disappearances seem unworthy of investigation, while Edward spoke about the betrayal of trust that occurred when government agencies, supposed to protect citizens, instead preyed upon the most vulnerable. The Morrison Foundation, established by Edward and Sarah with their Victim Compensation Awards, had grown into a significant advocacy organization for homeless individuals throughout the Southwest. The foundation operated shelters, provided legal assistance, and maintained a missing persons database specifically focused on homeless individuals who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Their work had already helped solve several cold cases and prevented additional disappearances through improved monitoring and support services. Congressional testimony revealed that the Dulce facility's activities had been funded through a complex web of classified contracts involving multiple agencies and private contractors. The money trail showed how legitimate research funding had been diverted to support illegal activities, with oversight officials either unaware of the true nature of the programs or complicit in covering up criminal activities. The financial complexity had made it difficult for legitimate oversight bodies to detect the illegal experimentation. Dr. Hawthorne's sentencing hearing provided additional insights into the mindset of the conspirators. Prison interviews conducted by federal investigators revealed that she genuinely believed her research was contributing to national defense and medical advancement. Her complete lack of empathy for the victims was particularly disturbing to observers, suggesting a level of psychological compartmentalization that allowed her to rationalize torture and murder as legitimate scientific inquiry. The international implications of the Dulce case were also significant. Human rights organizations had filed complaints with international courts, arguing that the United States had violated multiple international treaties and agreements regarding medical experimentation and treatment of vulnerable populations. The case had damaged America's credibility in international forums, where the government had previously criticized other nations for human rights violations. Agent Chen had been promoted to head a new FBI task force focused specifically on investigating classified research programs for potential human rights violations. His team was reviewing thousands of contracts and facilities throughout the country, looking for patterns similar to what had been discovered at Dulce. Early results suggested that illegal experimentation had been more widespread than initially believed, with evidence of similar programs in at least 6 other states. The psychological toll on the families of victims had been enormous, even for those who received legal vindication through the criminal prosecutions. Many family members struggled with guilt over not having searched more aggressively for their missing relatives, while others faced the trauma of learning exactly what their loved ones had endured. Support groups had been established to help families process the complex emotions associated with delayed justice and horrific revelations. Sarah Murphy had kept detailed records of every aspect of their investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings, creating a comprehensive archive that researchers and journalists continued to study. Her documentation provided insights into how ordinary citizens could effectively investigate cases that official authorities had abandoned, but also illustrated the enormous personal cost of pursuing justice against powerful institutional interests. The case had also highlighted the particular vulnerability of Native American communities to exploitation by government research programs. Several of the Dulce facility's victims had been members of nearby tribal communities, and tribal leaders testified about a long history of medical exploitation that the illegal experimentation program had continued. Congressional hearings addressed the need for specific protections for Native American individuals who might be targeted by future illegal research programs. As the broader implications of the Dulce conspiracy continued to unfold, Edward and Sarah faced the reality that their search for one missing friend had exposed systematic crimes that reached into the highest levels of government and medical research. Their persistence had not only brought justice for Alan Morrison, but had potentially saved countless future victims by exposing and dismantling a network of illegal experimentation programs that had operated in darkness for decades. In late 2013, nearly a decade after Alan Morrison's disappearance, a new revelation would shake the foundations of everything Edward and Sarah Murphy thought they understood about the conspiracy they had helped expose. Dr. Marcus Webb, a former Pentagon official who had overseen classified research contracts, contacted Agent Chen with information that suggested the Dulce facility was connected to an even more extensive and bizarre program involving alleged extraterrestrial research and reverse engineering operations. Dr. Webb's credentials were impeccable. A former Air Force colonel with a PhD in aerospace engineering who had managed classified research programs for over 20 years before retiring in 2010. His security clearances had given him access to some of the most sensitive programs in the American military-industrial complex, including projects that officially didn't exist and were denied by government agencies. What he revealed about the true nature of the Dulce facility challenged the very foundations of the criminal case that had already been concluded. According to Dr. Webb, the illegal human experimentation conducted at Dulce was not simply medical research gone wrong, but part of a larger program attempting to understand and replicate biological processes recovered from crashed extraterrestrial vehicles. The facility had been conducting genetic modification experiments designed to create human subjects capable of surviving in extreme environments, potentially for future space exploration, or to serve as test subjects for alien biotechnology that researchers were attempting to understand and reverse engineer. The extraterrestrial connection explained several puzzling aspects of the evidence recovered from the facility that had never been adequately addressed during the criminal trials. The sophisticated genetic modification equipment found at the site was far more advanced than anything available through normal government research programs. The experimental procedures documented in facility records involved techniques that seemed to be years ahead of publicly known medical capabilities. Most disturbing, some of the genetic material used in experiments appeared to be of non-human origin. Dr. Webb claimed that the Dulce facility was one of several installations throughout the Southwest that had been established to study and exploit recovered alien technology. The human subjects recruited through the homeless population had been used as test subjects for experimental procedures designed to understand how alien biological systems functioned and whether human physiology could be modified to interface with extraterrestrial technology. The high mortality rate among subjects was considered acceptable, given the potential military and scientific benefits of successful experiments. Agent Chen initially dismissed Dr. Webb's claims as the fantasies of someone whose career in classified programs had exposed him to too many conspiracy theories. However, Webb provided specific documentation that corroborated key aspects of his story, including contract numbers, facility locations, and personnel assignments that matched classified information only someone with his level of access could have known. More importantly, his information explained aspects of the Dulce facility that had remained puzzling even after the criminal convictions. The revelation forced Agent Chen to reopen aspects of the investigation that had been considered closed. New searches of the sealed Dulce facility uncovered additional laboratories and equipment that had been missed during the initial raid, including storage areas containing biological specimens that defied immediate classification. Independent laboratory analysis of some materials suggested non-terrestrial origins, though definitive conclusions were impossible due to the exotic nature of the samples. Elena Vasquez, when contacted about Dr. Webb's revelations, confirmed that she had witnessed procedures and observed materials during her time at the facility that she had never been able to explain or classify. She admitted that some of the genetic material used in experiments had been unlike anything in her medical training, and that facility personnel had referred to certain research programs using code names that suggested non-human origins for some of their specimens and procedures. The extraterrestrial connection also explained the extreme security measures and classification levels that had protected the facility for decades. If the illegal human experimentation was connected to recovered alien technology, the national security implications would justify almost any level of secrecy and protection from government oversight. The classification levels weren't just hiding medical crimes, they were protecting one of the most sensitive secrets in human history. Dr. Webb's information suggested that Alan Morrison and the other victims had died not just as subjects of illegal medical research, but as unwilling participants in humanity's first attempts to understand and exploit extraterrestrial biotechnology. Their deaths had been in service of experiments designed to prepare human subjects for contact with alien biological systems, or potentially to create hybrid beings capable of surviving in environments beyond Earth. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger and more bizarre than anyone had imagined. Congressional investigators were faced with an impossible dilemma when presented with Dr. Webb's information. If his claims were true, the Dulce facility represented not just a criminal conspiracy, but potentially the most significant scientific discovery in human history. However, investigating these claims would require revealing classified information about extraterrestrial research programs that could have profound implications for national security and public stability. The decision was made to classify Dr. Webb's testimony at the highest levels and continue the investigation through channels that would never become public. For Edward and Sarah Murphy, Dr. Webb's revelations were both vindicating and horrifying. Their years of investigation had uncovered not just a medical conspiracy, but potentially evidence of extraterrestrial contact and government cover-ups that reached far beyond anything they had imagined when they first began searching for their missing friend. Alan's death had been even more tragic than they had realized, sacrificed not just for illegal medical research, but for humanity's first fumbling attempts to understand technologies from beyond Earth. The extraterrestrial connection would never be officially acknowledged or investigated through public channels. Dr. Webb's testimony was classified, the additional evidence was sealed, and the official record continued to describe the Dulce facility as simply a case of illegal human experimentation. But for those who knew the full truth, the case represented something far more significant, The first public exposure of humanity's secret contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, revealed through the persistence of two people who refused to let one homeless man be forgotten. The deeper conspiracy would remain hidden, protected by classification levels that ensured the truth would never be fully revealed. But the human cost of that secrecy, the 200 victims whose lives were sacrificed for research into alien biotechnology, would stand as a testament to the dangers of pursuing scientific knowledge without regard for human rights or medical ethics, regardless of how extraordinary the potential discoveries might be. As 2015 arrived, 12 years after Alan Morrison's disappearance, Edward and Sarah Murphy found themselves guardians of secrets they could never fully share. The official record showed they had exposed illegal medical experimentation and brought justice to the perpetrators. The classified reality suggested they had uncovered evidence of extraterrestrial contact and government cover-ups that reached into the deepest levels of national security. The weight of both truths had fundamentally changed their lives and their understanding of their place in history. The Morrison Foundation had evolved far beyond its original mission of protecting homeless individuals. Under Sarah's leadership, it had become a national advocacy organization working to prevent government exploitation of vulnerable populations while secretly serving as a monitoring system for potential evidence of ongoing extraterrestrial research programs. Edward's military contacts provided intelligence about classified research contracts that might represent continuations of the programs they had exposed at Dulce. Dr. Elena Vasquez had retired from active medical practice, dedicating her remaining years to teaching medical ethics and speaking about the dangers of classified research programs. Her lectures at medical schools and conferences never mentioned the extraterrestrial connections she knew existed, but her warnings about government exploitation of vulnerable populations carried additional urgency for those who understood the full scope of what she had witnessed. Elena carried the burden of knowing that the true purpose of the experiments she had participated in could never be publicly revealed. Agent Chen had been promoted again, now heading a joint task force that officially investigated human rights violations in classified research programs while secretly monitoring for evidence of ongoing extraterrestrial research activities. His team maintained surveillance on former facility personnel and tracked government contracts that might represent continuations of the illegal experimentation programs. The public mission provided cover for investigations that could never be officially acknowledged. The sealed Dulce facility had become an unofficial pilgrimage site for conspiracy researchers and UFO investigators who sensed that something extraordinary had happened there. The simple granite memorial marker bearing the names of 200 victims told only part of the story, serving as a monument not just to illegal medical experimentation, but to humanity's first documented contact with extraterrestrial biotechnology. The full truth remained buried beneath tons of concrete that sealed the underground chambers forever. Congressional oversight of classified research programs had been significantly strengthened following the Dulce revelations, but the most sensitive aspects of extraterrestrial research remained protected by classification levels that prevented effective civilian oversight. The reforms protected vulnerable populations from future medical exploitation while ensuring that research into recovered alien technology could continue under better security and ethical guidelines. The compromise satisfied neither transparency advocates nor those who believed all extraterrestrial research should be terminated. Dr. Webb had disappeared in 2014, officially retiring to an undisclosed location, but actually entering a witness protection program designed to protect individuals with knowledge of the most sensitive government secrets. His revelations about extraterrestrial connections had been too dangerous to leave unprotected, and his expertise was too valuable to lose. He continued to provide classified briefings to authorized personnel about the implications of alien biotechnology for human medical research. The international implications of the Dulce case continued to reverberate through diplomatic channels, though the extraterrestrial connections were never publicly revealed. Foreign governments that had their own recovered alien technology programs recognized the deeper significance of the American revelations, leading to increased cooperation in research while maintaining public denial of any extraterrestrial contact. The conspiracy had become truly global, protected by mutual interests in maintaining secrecy. Sarah's detailed documentation of their investigation had been partially classified by federal authorities, with the most sensitive materials sealed for national security reasons. The portions that remained public served as a model for civilian investigation of government cover-ups, inspiring other families and advocacy groups to pursue cases that official authorities had abandoned. The classified materials provided intelligence agencies with insights into how civilian investigators could potentially uncover sensitive government programs. The psychological toll on Edward and Sarah had been enormous, compounded by their knowledge of secrets they could never share. They had sought justice for Alan Morrison and succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, but the full truth of what they had uncovered was too dangerous for public revelation. Their marriage had survived the stress of their investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings, strengthened by shared purpose and mutual support through unprecedented challenges. The victim compensation programs established following the Dulce revelations had provided financial support to families of the 200 confirmed victims, but could never adequately address the emotional trauma of learning that loved ones had been sacrificed for research into extraterrestrial biotechnology. Support groups for families operated under strict confidentiality agreements, providing psychological assistance while maintaining the secrecy that national security required. Alan Morrison's memory lived on through the foundation that bore his name and the legislative reforms that protected future vulnerable populations from government exploitation. His gentle spirit, documented in the testimonies of those who knew him, served as a reminder of the human cost of pursuing scientific knowledge without adequate ethical constraints. The homeless man who had helped plant flowers behind a small-town diner had become, through his tragic death, a catalyst for reforms that would protect countless future victims. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases throughout America. Thank you for following Alan Morrison's story. See you in the next video. The truth about Alan Morrison's disappearance had been revealed, but the deeper truth about humanity's contact with extraterrestrial intelligence remained hidden, protected by classification levels that ensured most people would never know the full scope of what Edward and Sarah Murphy had uncovered. Their search for one missing friend had exposed not just a criminal conspiracy, but potentially the most significant secret in human history, a secret that would remain buried in classified files, while the visible reforms and legal precedents served as monuments to their persistence and Alan's memory. In the end, justice had been served, but the complete truth remained forever beyond reach, echoing through classified corridors where the real work of understanding humanity's place in a larger universe continued in absolute secrecy.